mitigating online violence against women, as well as looking at tech issues from a gender perspective. And one of our researches last year covered data protection from a gender perspective. So I'm very excited to be here. Kiktonet is a member of AIRA.
Thank you. Victor?
Thanks. Thanks. My name is Victor Ndede. I work for Amnesty International, Kenya, as the digital rights manager. 2 projects majorly we are working on, actually 3. The first one is on data governance and basically looking at all the system structures that should be or are in place to manage our personal data and more or less the data protection program. And it's very heavy on awareness of data subjects and also obligations on data controllers. And the ultimate aim, of course, is to have the right to privacy respected in Kenya. Also run a project on digital rights for children and young people. And essentially here we're looking at how to make the internet a safe space for children and young people so that they're able to engage on the platforms, but also the platforms are mindful of their health and well-being as they do engage on the platforms. And lastly, it's a project on digital identity and seeing how to support the process with policy support and advocacy around human rights and data protection compliant digital identity system for Kenya. We're also members of AIRA, and I serve on the policy committee, which does what Florence said.
Okay. Thank you so much, Victor. Is anyone in the room interacting with AIRA for the very first time? By show of hand? Okay. So please keep your eyes on the screen. Control room, can we have the video? I think that was it. There's nothing like super visual.
In October 2020, 9 African organizations across the continent came together. We stand for accountability, inclusion, equity, and digital rights for all on the African continent. The African Internet.
We do not have the screen. Okay, as the technical team sets that up, so this session is going to focus on the need for gender responsive data governance policies and initiatives that will ensure. Yeah. Yeah, this session will focus on the need for gender responsive data governance policies and initiatives that will ensure that gender is mainstreamed in all aspects of digital rights. And like I've mentioned, the panelists that we have up here, like you've heard them, they have multitudes of experience. And in addition to sharing information, they are going to be stimulating, or helping us reflect on this discussion by raising key questions, also talking about emerging issues in the space that can help us further the discussion, but also give us the right context that we need. I think I'm not going to wait any further. I'm going to get right into this discussion. We can watch that video after they've explained what AIRA is or something. Yeah. Let me start with you, Angela. Angela, you've said you lead the Gender and Technology Department at Kiktonet. Could you kind of give us context? What is digital transformation? Because digital transformation as a concept has been around for a while, but also what does it have to do with digital rights?
Thank you. I think we can easily understand the context under the African development in this area. We've seen a lot of AU policies on digital transformation in Africa, and we now have the AU data policy framework, again, with a strong emphasis on digitalization. Africa is among one of the leading continents in the uptake of ICTs, and we've seen this in the rates of mobile penetration. So there's an emphasis even from the government that we need to have more digitalization in how we do our work, more digitalization in terms of embracing e-commerce and embracing e-government policies. We've also seen electronic, what do I call them? electoral processes that have a digitized concept to them. We've seen this in Kenya, and we've seen that with digitalization comes a lot for appetite for data collection. There's this, I don't want to call it a myth, but of course we need data collection as part of digitalization, but the same has to be done within a data protection framework. So digitalization to me would mean more embracing of ICTs in e-governance, in e-commerce, in all areas of life, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angela. I think that puts it in context. So you said there's a lot of appetite to collect data, but I guess the conversation is how do we ethically collect that data while respecting the digital rights of the people, which is exactly the place of digital rights in the whole process of digital transformation. Victor, why is data governance important? Angela's mentioned that there's lots of data collection that is happening, and I'm seeing in the region the conversation on data governance is gaining momentum, and I appreciate that most of you seated up here have been some of the pioneers in shaping the narrative around data governance. So why is data governance important, and how does it affect the ordinary person? I'm going to try and keep this conversation very, very basic, yeah? So please, I want you to give us the real gist of it.
Okay, thank you, Philip. So data governance essentially means a system. It's basically the systems, structures, institutions, institutional frameworks that exist to guide or basically guide how we manage data within a jurisdiction. So it could be a national jurisdiction, it could be a regional jurisdiction. And so data governance essentially looks at not just the law, but also the institutional frameworks, the policy frameworks, and all the mechanicals that are required to ensure that data is effectively managed. And so here you'd be looking at a law in the form of what we have in data protection acts across the continent. You'd be looking at institutions, which are the data protection authorities. You'd be looking at policies that could exist within the regional spaces, looking at the AU data policy, as Angela mentioned. So there are various sets of basically laws, rules, structures that govern how data is managed. And so the reason why data governance is important to what you call common mwananchi is because data is, of course, by far now the most a single important thing that mwananchi owns.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reason why we are keen on data governance is to ensure that a system, a structure is in place to ensure that this data that is a person, because often we tend to separate a person from their data and or perhaps at times look at someone as a data set.
Mm-hmm.
But behind these data sets are humans with rights, with dreams, with aspirations, you know. So the importance of it for the common mwananchi is essentially to have a system where rights are respected, their right to privacy, most importantly, because that's what most data protection laws actually came to do. But also to ensure that in as much as data is collected, data is processed, and as we move towards data for development, data protection is given prominence so that you don't suffer the benefit of using technology, but losing your right to privacy, losing your, and basically all other rights that can be infringed, from freedom of expression to all these other things. So that's why it's important to ensure that there's a proper system in place.
Thank you, Victor. I've stumbled upon a concept that they call the quid pro quo concept. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where there's an argument by especially big tech companies or even people in positions of control, because when you talk about data and data governance, there's an element of control, power, and benefit, where big tech companies or big tech firms have argued that without them providing us the platforms that they provided, our data would be useless. What do you make of that?
Well, it's not an argument I would agree with necessarily, because they're actually nothing without our data.
Right.
It's not us who are nothing without them.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason why, of course, all these guys thrive is because of our data. And so for us, we know is that we deny them our data, then they can't make the profits they're making. Their business model essentially collapses. And that's why they'll put up a huge war chest just to fight these data governance frameworks and data protection laws coming up across the world, because they're actually the greatest, if I would call them losers, when personal data is protected. And so it's them who need us.
Yeah. And I just want to pose one last question before I move on to the next speaker. A lot of the data governance conversations we keep seeing points to government, and I know, yes, that has been important at the moment, because there's not been laws. There's been laws, but there's not been deliberate laws talking to data governance. What does civil society and private entities, where is their position in the data governance process?
So yeah, and you're right. Initially, data governance conversations have primarily focused on regulation of government use of data.
Right.
But increasingly, of course, as we know, there's been need to also look at private sector use of data, and primarily big tech use of data. And so the role civil society has to play, one is to it's a strong continental movement, or a strong network of civil society organizations pushing for data governance frameworks across our countries, across regions, across the world. Because in the absence of data protection or data governance, or where data governance is more or less defeated, then it becomes very difficult for even people who use data to use data, because the system is then riddled with mistrust. Because if there's no law that protects my data, I'm very hesitant in giving away my data. And so it's very important that we have a system that allows for data use, but regulates how that data is used. And so civil society organizations play a key role in pushing for these frameworks, but also play a key role in giving citizens the agency to know these rights in data protection, their data subject rights, and so that they're also able to push. So we empower the citizens, we also hold government to account, and also big tech to account.
Thank you, Victor. And of course, as we talk about data rights, just like we said, digital rights and responsibilities, it's also important to mention that whereas you have data rights, but you also have a responsibility to, protect other people's data rights. Okay. Angela, over to you. We've had conversations around the existent laws, especially where I come from, being generic, not addressing especially the gendered aspects. And of course, our theme for this year's Data Fest is no gender equality without data equality. So why is it important to address the element of gender in this whole conversation around digital rights and data governance?
Thank you. And just to give some context, in the generic laws we have, maybe it's good to give how African governments started coming up with data protection laws. It more or less is shaped around the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations in the European Union. And these laws were not made with us in mind. They were made for Europeans, for a Western context, and really followed our Western norms and mores as at that time. So while we are accepting and adopting these laws, we are also adopting Eurocentric views in our legal systems. And part of this problem is that the Eurocentric view might also have gaps and lapses. So it means if we take it as it is, we take it with the problems they have. We see this with how gender is addressed in the GDPR and how gender is addressed in most of the African data protection legislations. And gender is almost, by the way, something to think about once you've implemented and you see the gendered impacts, the gendered negative impacts that data protection legislations can have. One of these is what we pointed out in our research on data protection from a gender perspective in Kenya. And we realized that, for instance, data that is collected, processed in household activities is not under the Data Protection Act in Kenya, for instance, and that is the same case in the GDPR. So you can see that. I would say that in the African framework, at least, the African Convention on Personal Data Protection, which has come into effect June this year, at least makes a caveat or an exemption to the effect that where that data is collected in household activities but used to harm or any other criminal activity, then it will be under the convention. So at least we're seeing changes in how data that is processed in household activities is being handled. And now data in the household activity has a gendered impact because we know that data breaches such as sharing of intimate images without the consent of the other partner has a data protection angle to it. And that will mean that if we do not amend our laws to have caveats where we say that where this data, yes, it is collected in household activities, but if it is used to harm, to perpetrate online gender-based violence, for instance, then the law should have provisions and safeguards for penalties and punishments and things like that. So this is an example of how gender is of concern in data protection. Another thing I'd like to shine light on is that gendered data or data on sex is already sensitive data. So that means any talks of gender and data protection should be talking about it on a sensitive data approach. And that will mean that there has to be consent. And where consent is not had, then this should be data for legitimate interests, okay? So I feel like sometimes we don't see the bridge between sensitive data and gendered data, because the law will talk about sex and sexual orientation, but not gender. Yet we know for a fact that how gender is shaped is based sometimes on sex. I hope that helps.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you so much, Angela. And Paul, we've already gotten into the challenges that are existing with the frameworks, with the ecosystem of data governance. I know CPS has carried out a study on data governance, I think from way back in 2019 or even last year. Which focused on now, the different countries. I know Kenya, Nigeria, and some other countries in Africa. What are some of, if you could just paint for us a picture of what the landscape looks like when it comes to data governance, but also what are some of the key messages that came out of the study or learnings that you would want to share?
Thanks, Philip. And so we've been doing studies on data governance. Specifically, what you're referring to was done in Kenya and Uganda, which was focused on COVID-19 data collection. In Ghana, we're looking at the levels of trust in data collection processes. Tanzania, we're focusing mainly on the legislative framework, and then Nigeria, we're looking at the ecosystem of data management. So many of the issues that have been spoken about actually resonate with what we were finding out from our research. But I don't want to repeat. Let me just focus on two issues. Number one, the issues of trust came out very strongly. Many of the people were very hesitant to participate in many of the data collection programs that were going on because they didn't trust the process. They were not sure of how their data would be used. And of course, it's not just in Uganda where if there is a data collection program, people are very hesitant to respond until the deadlines. And when you ask, people say, we don't know why our data is being collected, how it's going to be used, and how it's going to be managed. And number two is that there's been some progress in that many of the countries, not just 5, but across the continent, have made some progressive steps in passing laws, which is a good starting point. But again, after passing the laws, there is a lot of, I think, no movement towards making the regulations that can operationalize the laws, appointing the data protection authorities or commissioners, and also funding those data protection officers, because they can appoint you, but if they don't fund you, then it becomes very difficult for you to operationalize your office. In Uganda, I think we have a representative here, but the office is not funded fully. They have some staff, but they are still incapacitated to do all the mandate that is required of them. And I believe that's the same situation in Kenya. It's a big country, but if you have just maybe 10 program officers, it is difficult for you to implement the mandate that you have. Then Three, there is lack of awareness of these programs. So government just start implementing these programs. So there are so many programs that are collecting data across the continent. There is SIM card registration, which government just comes and says it is mandatory, you must register your SIM cards. National identity cards, many programs across the continent. Many countries are implementing those data national ID registration programs. Then, of course, data collection through visas. When you're applying for visas, a lot of data is collected. And as we're discussing in the morning, we don't know how this data is eventually de-identified once the purpose for which it is collected is finished. So these are some of the things that we're finding, and there is progress, but again, it is slow. So it is difficult to say, okay, we have made progress, but again, there are challenges. So we appreciate the laws are there. Some countries are appointing data commissioners, but again, what happens? We need these officers to be empowered for the processes to move ahead.
I have just two counters probes for you on there. One is where I mentioned that there was a lack of trust. And of course, we continue to see the conversation on how to build trust in the citizen increasing. In data governance, the refusal for the data subjects to give out data to whether government or private entities is data in itself. Yeah, it points to something, it tells a story, or it points to a loophole in the system, which you've mentioned. But I want to ask you, is that a good thing that data subjects are refusing to give their data because they don't trust the system? I know it counters the whole idea, but is that a good thing?
Number one, data is very important for planning purposes, because you need to know the number of people that you have. You need to have information of their disaggregated in terms of age, in terms of gender, and other demographics. It is very important. But if I don't know why you are collecting my data, then I think I can refuse, because I have rights as a data subject. Mm-hmm. You must tell me why you are collecting my data, and then give me reasons why you need my data, the amount of data that you need from me, and what you're going to use it for. And once the purpose is done, then you must also inform me when you're going to identify it, so it is very important for me as a data subject to know the reasons as to why you're collecting my data. So I don't want to say it is a good thing, but I think it shows that the data subject knows their rights. Yeah. And it is up to you now, the person who is collecting the data, mm-hmm. to really convince me that actually when you give me this information, I'm going to use it for this reason. Like I have seen your registration form. I think the ones I've signed on, the column for numbers is not filled up. Mm. So I'm not sure if that's a good thing or it is a bad thing. So because I didn't fill it because I didn't know why you didn't my number. Right. Yeah, so maybe for you it's bad because maybe you want to contact me, but because you didn't explain to me.
And I hope no one coerced you to give in your number.
No. But I just looked at it and was like, okay,
right.
I need to be convinced. So it might be bad on your side, but it's good for me because I'm like, okay, I would have willingly given out my number because it is in other public places. But for this particular one, I was like, maybe I don't know why he's collecting it.
Yeah. Sometimes when I'm doing data protection trainings, the very first activity I do with the participants is I have a printed paper that has all this personal biodata, from their name, where they stay, how many children they have, how much they earn, their phone number, the phone number of their parents, their NIN, the national ID number, and you tell them, fill out the form. And for me, the intention is to see if anyone is going to ask questions. And of course, sometimes you have people that refuse. They're like, why do you need this much information? But then I still have people pull out their wallets and look at their national ID and write the number. So for me, saying that some people are refusing, some people don't trust the system, in one way, I would say it's a good thing because this is exactly what you're talking about. People should understand their data rights. So there's a point of consent. If someone doesn't consent, that I think it's safe to say we are making progress. You also mentioned something around how data is being used, how long it's kept. You know, someone mentioned when we did with Kiktanet, when we did the study on COVID-19 and surveillance practices across countries in East Africa. Someone made the comment, I think in one of the webinars, that we are yet to see COVID results at Rolex stores. For those that are coming from Uganda, you know what a Rolex is: a chapati and an egg inside. they make paper bags, because in the past we have seen people's personal data from university transcripts to HIV results being used and COVID, because now this speaks to the whole data governance cycle, because the very last bit of it is destruction, and it seems like people don't know what exactly destruction is. For those private entities that collect data, when you collect people's data, and at the end of it you finish using it, throwing it at the bin doesn't cut it as destruction, because that's a data breach actually. So thank you so much, Victor, for providing that context. And I want to get to you, Florence, to kind of give us context at the national level in Kenya here. What is the policy and legal framework for data governance? To what extent does it address the gender issue? And I know Angela spoke about it briefly, but if you could give us that macro context.
So I'll just begin from the apex of it, which is the Constitution of Kenya, which firstly speaks to elements of lack of discrimination across a wide board. So we have Article 27 of the Constitution, I think, should be subsection something 3, I think, if I'm not wrong, that speaks to elements of the lack of discrimination. Then, which brings us down to Article 31, which speaks to the right to privacy. And that's where we find nuances that arise in terms of data protection, and now which feed into data governance issues. So running down from the Constitution, of course, we have now the Data Protection Act that was enacted in 2019. So as Angela has just mentioned, again, elements of gender are not necessarily alive, I would say, within the Data Protection Act. The elements that you'd have to like pull out from a reading of the Data Protection Act in terms of rights of the data subject, in terms of duties and responsibilities, then directly apply them to now situations that may arise with respect to gender data in that capacity. So from that, we also have the fact that we also are signatory to some international instruments, which would bring in gendered aspects when looking at data or apply it in that capacity. So we have CEDAW, which is a convention on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. Then we have the ICCPR, which also speaks to the same in different capacities. So you'll notice that with all these regulations, they're not necessarily outwardly present. It's not something that's outwardly present. These are elements, a gendered aspect is something that you'd have to pull out in terms of applying the laws in different capacities and in different respects, and then now feeding that into trying to come up with a data governance framework of sorts. So I would also say when you're speaking to a data governance framework, it could be two-pronged. You could have a data governance framework. You could have a document that you say, okay, so this is a data governance framework that we have for whatever reason, for the country, for different ministries. You could have a data governance framework and say, this is the data governance framework. But then within the country, just based on the rules, regulations, and policies that exist, you can try and form a structure of what a data governance framework in a country could look like, which is sort of the example that I've given. You go from the Constitution, then you go to the Data Protection Act, then you go to other subsidiary legislations or policies that have been developed that may speak to data protection in different capacities. Then you come up with sort of what you would call a data governance framework. However, you'd also have to recognize the fact that when you're speaking about a data governance framework, there's specific elements that must be included in what we call a data governance framework. So for some of the ministries within the Kenyan government, you'll find that right now, currently, it's about only 2 ministries that have what we call an actual data governance framework. You'll find it's the Ministry of Agriculture, surprisingly. They have a data governance framework, and the Ministry of Health, which is also not surprising because the Ministry of Health does deal with a lot of personal information, sensitive data in that capacity. So it would be more of a mystery if they didn't have a data governance framework, because also within the health sector, they from practice already have specific internal rules and regulations that govern how they deal with client data and personal information in that capacity, or health data, what we'd now call health data. So for the Ministry of Agriculture, for example, their data governance framework is specifically for the implementation of projects that would be able to include digitization and improve agriculture within the Kenyan country. So when you go through that data governance framework, you'll find that it gives a structuring of the kind of data that should be collected or that will be collected with respect to farmers. So within that categorization, there's only one element that speaks to collecting information on gender. So you'll find that you either take whether you're as a farmer, are you a man or you're a woman. So that's it. So based on other information, then maybe based on whether somebody takes man or woman, what you'd be able to now disaggregate at the bottom is where they indicate what kind of farming they do, income, which areas they highlight farming and such. That's the information that you'd be able to disaggregate. Now, you wouldn't be necessarily sure that once the collection process is done, during the processing, you wouldn't be necessarily sure that this information on that they would apply a gendered aspect to the processing of that data. It might be that they just collected it to be able to note that this man, woman, this is what they have, this is what their contribution is to the families, this is what their contribution is in terms of farming and in terms of agriculture. But if you look at it in an agricultural perspective, and you look at agriculture in the country, you'll note that women play a major role in agriculture in the country, and their contribution is not as minimal as more people would like to make it. Yesterday, we had a presentation by, I'm forgetting her name, but she's from Aga Khan University, where she mentioned, she created a scenario whereby one of, Rachel Correa is her name, she created a situation whereby land ownership for her was impossible, then it became possible. But now with land ownership, she created for her a universe whereby, based on the fact that she could now be able to own land, she could be able to farm, she could be able to do other things with the land with respect to agriculture, she could be able to till, and then that would, of course, feed into the economic perspective she would bring into it. So in as much as the disaggregation of data is there in terms of identifying you as a man or a woman is there, you're not necessarily sure that once that data is collected during the processing, that information will be given a gendered lens.
Would you paint for me a picture on what that would look like?
A picture of
the gendered element in the processing of the data.
A gendered element in the processing of
using
data.
the very case study of of agriculture data.
Okay, so how that would look like is so one of the key things researchers try and do is try to implement a gendered aspect in everything that they're doing. So you've collected the data, you've said that you've highlighted that you're a woman, so there's a segregation between man and woman. That's the data that you have. Then you have data that also feeds into what areas, geographical areas you're from, what farming you undertake, what areas of agriculture you're specifically focused on, what areas that also entail. You've also highlighted whether you receive financial assistance in terms of your farming, in terms of your marketing. You've also highlighted that. You've also highlighted the regions and the markets within which you receive such assistance. You've also highlighted how many people you work with within your specific farm. So if you look at that data and you don't apply a gender perspective to it, there's a couple of things that you'll miss. One, it's very likely that you'll miss the number of women who do farming, who are involved in agriculture in the country. Two, you will miss data on whether more women or more men are the ones who own land, farming land in the country. You'll also miss information on the specific areas in which women mostly farm on, because you might find people carry agriculture more in poultry or more in terms of maize and other crops, or it is in terms of animal rearing. So if you have that type of segregation, you'll be able to tell like where women are mostly structured to. And if you're trying to attribute assistance of any capacity within the agricultural sector, you'll be able to sort of figure out the balance. And if it's more women than men, then it prompts you to sort of think, why is it more women in this area? Why is it more men in this area? Do they have more financial assistance? Is more financial assistance being provided to women who do farming within this area or within the other area? Also, just painting out geographical areas in which agriculture is being done. It also helps you spot, like, in which areas do we have more women who are involved in agriculture? In which areas do we have more men? If we have more women on this side, why do we have more women? If there's less women on this side, what's happening to the women population on this side who are involved in farming and such like things? So that's how I'd probably paint it in that
Very,
capacity.
very comprehensive. And of course, the aspect of who is giving women money in farming, those are all things that could be. So I was given this very long questionnaire to ask these people, but I refused to follow it. My boss, probably I'll be in trouble with the AIRA boss, but I want to open up this the audience to ask some questions so far from the discussions we've had. Is there anything that doesn't sit well with you? Do you want to probe anything? Anyone? If not, I'll go back to my questionnaire. I just want to make sure no one sleeps. So please, someone should save the day. Surely, if you came to this session, you must have had, something that you wanted. So, anyone? You want to ask them questions? Since you're not asking, the panelists want to ask you. But well, please keep thinking about, the discussion, and then let us know if you have any questions. I want to move to you, Victor. Florence has given us kind of a national overview of what data governance looks like. And I know that at Amnesty International, you're working on a regional policy on data governance. Do you want to tell us about this?
Yeah, thanks, Philip, again. So yeah, not quite working on it, but it's work in progress. Yeah. And so maybe perhaps I can just share the thinking behind the recent push towards a regional data governance framework. And largely it's informed by the fact that the continent is heavy leaning towards trade. And even when you look at our regional economic communities, they're very trade driven. If you look at how they've structured the integration process, I would we can work with a case study of the East African community. In the first two steps of our regional integration was a customs union and a common market, which ideally means that you have sort of a single customs territory, but also when you look at the common market, you're looking at free movement of goods, services, labor, all these things. With that happening, it means that people are crossing borders, data is being shared across borders, or what you'd call now the cross-border data flows. And the protections I have in Kenya, I have no guarantee of having similar protections in another country within the region. Initially, either because there was no law in that country, or even in the case of a law, the protections are not equivalent, or they're not at the same level. And so it creates this disharmony in how your data is protected. So you could pride yourself that my data is sufficiently protected in Kenya, but given how things are moving within the continent, especially on trade, my data flows to a country that has totally no protection. And so while it is important that we focus on municipal laws, I mean country laws on data protection, I think for harmony and especially for coherence, especially on managing cross-border data flows, you need sort of a regional framework on it, so that it's a uniform standard applied across. And so that facilitates trade, facilitates innovation, facilitates development. And that's why we saw that it's very important and necessary that we prioritize a regional framework, largely because we are anchored around trade as a continent. I mean, recently, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, you can imagine the nature of the cross-border data flows, intra-African data flows, in the absence of sort of a harmonized regional framework. So the risks that we see, especially when it relates to people engaging on the online platforms, could easily outweigh the benefits of people engaging on these digital platforms. And so it is necessary that there's a common standard. And as you remember, when we started this session on data governance, we essentially want a system, structure, and institutions that really facilitate proper management of our data, and of course, allow for development, allow for innovation, allow for trade.
Right. This reminds me of a statistic I came up of, I think, Morocco or Tunisia, that made an assessment in terms of cross-border data transfers on who on the African continent qualifies, which country qualify to receive their data in terms of cross-border. And they found out that none. I think either you know about that statistic?
No.
Yeah. So it was quite shocking. So for me, when you speak about a regional data framework, and when you say regional, is that like East African? Because I know Amnesty is kind of, it's just East Africa.
So yeah, I mean, initially the thinking is around the regional economic communities, because as you do realize is that a lot of our continental policy positions are not easily adopted across. And you could just see that on the uptake of Malabo.
Yeah.
I mean, we have struggled since Malabo came into place to get signatures on it. We now have the AU data policy. But if you look at how policy frameworks have been implemented or have been adopted within the regional economic communities, they've been more useful. In fact, you see scenarios where countries would even default on payments to their AU, their annual subscriptions, but they pay for their regional economic communities, because that's where they've centered, or that's where they sort of have their belonging. And so it's easy to enforce some of these things at a regional level, and maybe at some point then collate everything that is happening within these regional economic communities into sort of a continental conversation. But it's more or less now building from the bottom upwards in terms of regional frameworks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Victor. Speaking about repealing some of these protocols, I mean, we've talked about the Malabo, and now we've struggled over the years to get signatures on it. What are some of the challenges? And this question goes to you, Angela. What are some of the challenges that the Data Protection Act here in Kenya is facing? Because I know there's been the commissioning of the PDPO, the registration process has kicked off. Has there been a compliance report yet from the office? No?
So what I know so far is we're struggling with compliance and just raising awareness. As I have said, ours is a Data Protection Act that is commercially biased. So it's thinking about data protection in terms of businesses. So we are yet to get other non-commercial entities like universities, civil society, seeing themselves as data controllers and processors. I'd also say that it will be interesting to see how we deal with big tech companies that are not necessarily based in Kenya, but are processing Kenya's data or collecting data in Kenya and processing the same. I think the next step for civil society in Kenya is to go beyond raising awareness and to start looking at the business models of both big tech companies and companies based in Kenya in how they process data, especially sensitive data. We need to start now moving to how is Google, how is Microsoft, how is Zoom collecting data, how are they using it and stuff like that. And that will also be a point of growth for the ODPC, because they will be implementing the Data Protection Act in a more substantive way.
Right.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Speaking about initiatives in the region, of course, Paul, you're part of AIRA. CPESA is part of AIRA. What are some of the opportunities from the work and the research that you've done over the years or recently? What are some of the opportunities that you see for collaborative initiatives, and policy advocacy for more responsive gender responsive data governance frameworks?
I think there are quite a numbers. We have already discussed one. We talked about the existing legal frameworks, much as they have gaps, but I think it's a good starting point for us as the members within the coalition, but also anybody who is interested in issues of data governance to pick a keen interest and so look at what is happening in Kenya, what lessons can we learn from there. Kiktanet have done a good job. So if I'm in Uganda, if I want to challenge or look at our policy and see the existing gaps, I need to, first of all, contact my colleagues and say, what did you do right? And that I can copy. So finding out from colleagues within different countries what you're doing, and then we try to replicate within what we are doing in our countries. Number two is as members of civil society and probably academia is to pick interest in what is happening in our ecosystem. First is we were discussing about the underfunding of the data protection authorities. So we need to really pick interest in the budgeting processes, because it is mostly under, I think, ministers of ICT, especially maybe in Uganda, that's where the DPOs are domiciled. So pick interest in the budgeting process so that we are able to try and push for budget allocations for these departments, but also meetings and conversations like these ones provide opportunities for us to discuss some of the things like Data Fest. I think we have been discussing data and you see learning lessons from each other and how what we can do best. So participating in these conversations also provides an opportunity for us to collaborate and learning from each other, especially what is happening. And I think also, yes, going back to the laws, they are good, but they have challenges. So trying to study them and try to identify the key gaps that are existing, and then we challenge them. So let us not wait until the law is passed and signed. So if we hear about a law being drafted, let us be involved in the process, including appearing before different parliamentary committees to make submissions. What I normally see is that make an analysis and publish on our website. It does not reach the relevant committee. So yes, it will be, people will download it, but you need to reach the right people. I know some people who went, I think, out of the way, I could say think out of the box. They had good money. So on the day of passing of the law, they actually sponsored some members of parliament to not to appear in cabinet, not to appear in parliament. So the law was passed
in Uganda?
in some country.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can be as flexible as that, but also in many of these parliaments, the people who are entrusted with drafting some of these laws have no drafting capacity. So if you have a team of lawyers, they may not be in parliament, who have some experience in drafting these laws, I think it is important for us to engage with these committees and then draft these laws. I think lawyers will tell you that when they say the minister shall lay the regulations of parliament, it's different when the text is the minister may. So these may look like small words, but if you participate in the processes, it makes a big difference in the implementation of the law.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. Is there a question online? Could we see that? And of course, the people in the room, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot. Okay, thank you. Let me quickly scroll here. Could you scroll up? Okay, I think this is from Gibson Minor. Gibson Minor from Mthare Infotech Lab. Is any of the organizations that the panelists are from working on localizing the conversations? I think you made conversations around data governance and policies, so that the terminologies and the concepts are understood by the common Mwananchi, so that the Mwananchi are empowered to engage and participate effectively in these conversations and in the digital space, because much of what is going on seems to be elitist talk. And for people with certain level of education or ICT background, this is a great question. And we continue to see the conversation around digital rights and data rights being elitist. And to make matters worse, we continue to do researches and publish reports of 50 pages, and that is it. How are we localizing the conversation? Anyone wants to take a go at it? Yeah, Angela.
So last year, we had a very interesting data protection campaign that was not just centered in Nairobi, but we did it in Kisumu, Kakamega. Yeah, Kisumu and Kakamega. And we also tried to diversify the materials around data protection so that we had the policy brief, of course, very advanced for policymakers. And then we had a comic strip, and it was also translated into Swahili. So it's called Wanawake na Data. And it's just a short story following the life of a woman who's vying for presidency. We see how data breaches can be weaponized against women in politics because they're very outspoken. And then we try to raise awareness around the complaints handling mechanism under the Data Protection Act, as well as in the social media platforms. This is important because beyond raising awareness, we need to give the common Mwananchi tools on how to implement or enforce their data subject rights. It's one thing to know your right, it's another thing to get a remedy when your right is violated. So these materials are on our social media, on our website. You can get them, just Google Wanawake na Data, or if you want the more complex, nuanced policy brief, then it is it's data protection, gender perspective by Kiktonet.
Thank you, Angela. Is there any questions from the? Yes, as we take the microphone to the lady in blue, Victor, how creative can we get when it comes to localizing data governance conversations?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we did realize when we rolled out, when we were starting our work around this space, one of the things we conducted was a baseline study, which was more like an opinion poll, just to understand what is the state of awareness on data protection in Kenya. And obviously, the awareness was significantly very low. And part of it is what is being raised by the colleague there from Mathare around localized content. One of the things we have endeavored to do is most of the time, this conversation has been said to be a lawyer's techies conversation. And so what we have increasingly done is worked with community groups, human rights defenders, and people within their spaces, even religious leaders, to sort of understand this concept. In Kenya, we had initially said that it looked to be a very Nairobi-centric conversation, so that all data protection conversations were happening within the city. So you'd not find a lot of this information getting to the ground. And so one of the things we also endeavored to do was to support and work with the Data Protection Authority, who has the mandate to go around the country and educate Mwananchi on this. And I'm sure they've done a couple of information and education materials, but I think the bottom line for this is, of course, we need to get these conversations out of the usual spaces, out of the echo chambers, so that we get to the data subjects. And for us, the priority is the data subject. I think in the previous session, we earlier here in the morning shared that once the data subject is aware, then most of the things will start falling into place.
Right.
And so we have to go to that person, to the last person.
They'll ask the right questions and the uncomfortable questions, yeah?
Yes.
Lady in blue, please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. My name is Tabitha Wangeshi. I would first like to ask Angela, she mentioned that the Data Protection Act in Kenya faces two challenges. Number one, commercialization, and the other one is lack of awareness. I would like to ask, is this related to the fact that most data protection authorities are underfunded? Are they now turning to become money-oriented rather than protecting the interest of citizens? To ask Florence, do you think research is being used now, for example, by CPIT, to achieve data justice? Is it enough? And what can citizens do to contribute to the achievement of data justice? Thank you.
Anyone wants to go first? Angela, you want to go first?
Yes, I had spoken about how the problem we have with the data protection legislations in Africa is that they're Eurocentric. And they're not only Eurocentric, but they are commercially biased. Remember that most laws are being modeled around the European Union's GDPR. And this is a regional, more or less a regional trade bloc coming up with a law. Of course, they were thinking about businesses. Of course, most of the case laws and the law and the news we get from the EU are Meta has been fined this. It's always almost a commercial entity that has misused data in a commercial activity. So as Africa, we need to shape our data protection legislation. As my co-panelists have pointed out, we have challenges around how we have shaped the data narrative, that it is a business thing. Yet we know that data comes with surveillance, data comes with, is the consent informed? When you're giving consent for your data to be collected, is it informed? Is it necessary? So asking questions about data minimization, asking questions around, does the data subject understand that they have a right to withdraw consent even after they gave consent for their data to be collected? So awareness raising is one thing, but also looking at the substantive effect of that awareness raising activity. We need to move beyond just saying, hey, we have a Data Protection Act, and getting more specific around consent, getting more specific around helping the common Wananchi understand what is cookies, or how is their data being collected on the website, and what rights do they have, if any, to withdraw that consent. I'd give you an example that I was recently in Europe, and over there, the data protection regime is so advanced to the sense that when I'm on a website, when there's cookies, I have an option to say, you can only use my data for operationalizing this website. You can use my data for marketing products. You can use my data for so and so. In Kenya, the same website, it might even be the same provider, same company. They'll just tell you allow cookies, and you'll allow cookies. So you can see the levels of development in understanding these concepts is very different. And for us to get there, it will mean that our awareness raising is more substantive and more impactful, so that people understand exactly why data is the new oil and why they need to have more control over their data.
Angela, I every time I hear someone say that the new oil, I interject. Because that statement asks people to exploit, because oil is supposed to be exploited. Yeah. But thank you so much for that.
Being exploited, but you can have it in a streamlined data protection framework, right. But we're going to be exploited.
There's a question you've not answered about some of these challenges emanating from the...
I've explained why it's commercially biased, in the sense that this is a law that was created in the context of trade.
Right.
Okay. And so most of the way it's framed, you will notice they're talking about compliance. I mean, who will think about compliance if it's not a company that is setting up? You understand? Or a company that is operational in a country. Mm-hmm. So there's this connotation that this is a commercial issue. This is a business issue, yet it is not, because the impacts data collection has and processing has goes beyond the commercial aspects of data protection and processing.
Thank you. Florence.
So to answer your question, I would say that so when you look at data justice, what you're focusing on specifically, especially for people in research, what you're focusing on specifically is representation, is ensuring that there's accurate representation of different aspects and especially marginalized communities. You're trying to ensure that there's accurate representation across the board in any research that you're undertaking. So for CPIT, for example, for us, depending on the research that you're undertaking, if it's in data protection, let's say, if it's in AI even, if it's in data governance, if it's in trying to establish data governance framework across countries in Africa, trying to apply not just a gendered lens, but looking at it in a perspective of when it comes to impact, who is it impacting and how far down does it go? And ensuring that that is captured across the board, as opposed to just surface-based knowledge or information on this is how it is applied, this is who it impacts, and then you stop from there. You always have to go deeper and sort of figure out what elements, who does it impact, and the people who it impacts, in what capacity does it impact. Sometimes it could be in terms of getting information from other CSOs that you may have liaised within this information. Sometimes it may be as much as doing the primary data collection yourself. But in the primary data collection in itself, you also have to make sure that elements, even the principles of data justice that we just discussed, have been incorporated in them in terms of power dynamics. Are you factoring in power dynamics when you're sort of collecting your data? Are you also considering it in as you're writing your work and as you're trying to establish impact? Are you looking at knowledge? To what extent is the knowledge that you're being given, or the knowledge that you're trying to get from that community? Also, what is the involvement of that community in trying to give you that knowledge? And are they knowledgeable that they're giving you this information? And will they be acknowledged and represented within the work that you're doing as well? So just in consideration of that and all the other principles that we mentioned on data justice, ensuring that all those nuances come out clearly within the research work that we're doing.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Bernard, do you have any hard question for the panel? I'm putting you on the spot. All right, I think as we wrap up, I'm just going to pose 2 questions to all the panelists to quickly go through them. And I want to start with you, Florence, who has the microphone. Victor already mentioned that there's need for regional frameworks because there's more uptake for those, but because also countries feel like this resonate. Oh, yes. You have a question? Please. Could you give the microphone to Victor? Victor, do you want to take that?
Yeah, and the example is very interesting because actually when you go to the data commissioner's office, you actually deposit your ID and the passport if you're a non-resident. Well, I don't hold their brief here, but
guys online did not hear apparently, so they need me to repeat.
Sure.
My question is to the panel. Anyone can answer. For those of you online, my question was, why is it so difficult for us to implement, yet we have such great laws in some of our countries? And forget the legislation, I mean, that we do very well. And I've given an example of when you go to our data agencies, whichever you're going to go to, at the entrance, when you're getting in, the security person is going to say, you know, leave your identification card. As one of our panelists said, you can leave your passport or some form of identification that, you know, ensures that they know who exactly has gone in. So why are we having such a hard time implementing?
Yeah, sure, thanks. And just as I started saying is, of course, I don't hold their brief here, but what I know is they've been working on some regulations or a sector guidance note on private securities. The Kenyan example is that the activity or the action of you leaving your identity documents or perhaps writing it down in what is at times called the Book of Truth, your details is provided for in another law that predates the data protection law. And even that law, how different people have interpreted it, is what has led to the different ways people collect data. So there are some who will retain your ID, there's some who will have you write your details on a book. But importantly, on the question of implementation, there are two sides to it. First is of course the capacity of the Data Protection Authority to enforce across the country. Of course, we know they're short-staffed, underfunded, and all those things that come with new offices that did not come at the will of the powers that be. And so they, of course, have their fair share of challenges and frustrations. But the other bit also involves the lack of privacy culture, as I would call it, because one of the things we keep on saying is that for us, we believe that if a data subject is aware of that these are my rights, and you, of course, have the right to object to processing of all or part of your data as per the Kenyan Data Protection Act. The moment people resist, these people actually usually conform to what they're supposed to do, or like the data controllers actually start taking measures to respect people's data. But we still have a culture where people freely give information, and so it empowers if I would call them the perpetrators, to keep doing so. And so one of the things we're trying to see is in this country and perhaps the region is if we can actually get an attitude shift towards data and people appreciating the value of their data. And because it's not appreciated that much, I don't think the political system appreciates it equally. And so the political will and the political backing that would be afforded to a data protection authority or data protection conversations would be very low. And political will has been what has impeded the sign-ons onto the Malabo Convention over the last couple of years, because just a total lack of political will. So if the citizens don't consider it as a major issue, the political system will not see it and will just remain in that same loop. I think that's the answer I would offer you. Yeah.
I'd like to add more context from a gender perspective. Last year, when we were asking women what they understand privacy to mean, they'll talk about modesty, they talk about covering themselves, closing their doors. So there's need for a mindset shift from privacy being a physical issue to privacy moving towards the data, personal data. So as having a woman now start thinking that, okay, the photos I share online, I should be thinking about them the same way I think about my information offline. So there's a way we look at privacy that might not really meet they might not be, how can I say this? We need a privacy shift so that we can see our data as something that we need to protect. As it stands, we have a culture of oversharing and complying. So we don't even question, you want my ID, take, you understand? And not understanding that what is the impact of me giving so much of my data to these authorities. I hope that helps.
3 questions in the room. Go for it, sir.
Hi, everyone. I want to add to what the 2 panelists have said. And I want
Your
to,
name?
My
maybe?
name is Francis Monyango.
Okay.
And basically it's a comment to the impact of culture. Also, if you look at legislation in Kenya in the past, in the many years, especially security legislations, there's a lot of personal information collection. Regulations Act, it requires all entities, and that was necessitated by Visa T15, and then the act came in 2016. You look at, and it limits both personal autonomy, so you have to be screened and be searched, and they also have to take record of your personal identifiable information. Fast forward 2020, look at in London, when you're getting into the pubs during COVID, you had to register. Same concept in Kenya that was being done because of terror. You see it being done because of public health. Those are limitations that are there in the act, and also they are, let me call them acceptable limitations to privacy and data protection laws. But the issue that is there is the culture of forcing issues on people and not explaining why things are being done. If you're being told that it is required, that's not an adequate answer. Most of the time I usually comply when they ask me, but I ask them, do you know you're actually required to explain to me why you're collecting this information and how long you're going to keep it? That's the law. I understand the law requires you to take the information, but you also have obligations and responsibilities as a data controller. Most of the time the guys are like, as we're just doing our job, we do not know, we were just told to do this. And that shows you that now, once the guidance note or the regulations for the private security comes out, they need to factor in those things for private security companies to comply, like communicate to the people whose data you're collecting. And that will also help in creating the culture. There's a study that was done by Amnesty International in 2021, and there was a previous one that was done in 2019. And in those 2 studies, you'll see there was an increase in privacy awareness within the country. And that shows that after the act came into force, people started thinking about this. Personally got into privacy way back before people started talking about privacy. But now I meet people working as DPOs, and 7 years ago, they wanted to be commercial lawyers. They were not even thinking about privacy. It shows that with the coming in force of the act, people are getting aware. And whatever ODPC is doing at the moment, going down to counties, whatever Kicktenet is doing, going to Kakamega and other places, whatever Amnesty is doing, working at the county governments, eventually these efforts will pay off and people will be aware. And the Mwananchi will be able to ask the hard questions, they will be able to report to the ODPC. Companies and entities will start complying, and we will have built our privacy and data protection culture.
Thank you, Francis. So you say it's a process. We should be positive and keep doing the work. Yeah. There was another question. Francis, as they take a microphone, you think having more fines and penalties would increase compliance? Is that a way to go?
Okay, thank you.
Angela disagrees, right? Bonaventure.
My name is Bonaventure from Policy. Mine is about these big tech companies. Yes, we have the national laws and all these. So to what extent do they regulate these big tech companies? To what extent does the Ugandan law regulate Google or Facebook, or do we put that into context? That's a question I wanted to pose to you. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just a quick response. Yeah, regulation of big tech has been in the talks, especially amongst our data protection authorities. I think I've had it where our data protection authorities have made saying they need to start regulating big tech. But big tech is very complicated to even commence investigations against them. The technical skill required, the amount of money required to run through an entire, a full investigation against big tech by far supersedes budgets of many of our data protection authorities. And as such, as they remain underfunded and of course that means then they cannot hire the skills that they would need. I don't think it's very easy for us to get to that point at this moment in time.
Okay. Rebecca? Okay. Please. Yeah.
Okay. I have two questions. The first question is, speaking of inclusivity, to what extent are we bringing on board children and minors in these conversations of data governance? Just yesterday, we were having a conversation here on Internet of Things, and someone presented a project on a pad dispensing machine, which seemed to elicit a lot of reaction because everyone felt that it was collecting more data from these kids, unaware than the amount of impact it was having. And then the second question would be just to paint a picture for me from your perspective. In a utopia, what would a robust data governance system that eliminates gender bias look like? Thank you.
Anyone wants to take a go at that?
I can do
Let
that.
her take
You can
the-
go ahead.
No,
Go
no,
ahead.
no.
Mhm.
There's a question that was asked by him, and I wanted to supplement somebody's answer, and also another question that was posed. So maybe you go first, then I'll say something.
Okay, okay. Please, Florence.
I will take the one on children and try and paint the dystopian picture. So for children, I know there's quite a bit of work that's being done with respect to data protection, online protection for children. However, the tricky bit is that children are often left as a by the way. Assumption is that if the big people know about data protection, then the assumption is that the big people are the big ones, and they're the ones who are the parents, they're the ones who are the aunties, they're the ones who are the cousins, they're the nephews and the nieces. So it will automatically trickle down, because at the end of the day, it's the big people's responsibility to also take care of the rights of the children, which is also what is in the Data Protection Act to a certain extent. However, you'll notice that children also understand things faster. And some of the organizations in Kenya that are dealing with children's rights have very specific programs that are geared towards children and trying to assist them in trying to understand their data protection rights, what data protection rights they have. Because ultimately, even in law, they can only exercise those rights to a specific extent. It's the big people's responsibility to make sure that they are taken care of, which is understandable, of course. But in what small nuanced ways can children also sort of start protecting their own data and themselves? But then again, the responsibility goes back to, like the example you've given, the pad dispensing machine. Who set it up? Who set up that pad dispensing machine? Who decided that this is the amount of information that we require from them to be able to set it up? And by the time it was being put, wherever it was being put, where were the big people in the conversation? Were they not aware that there's a little bit too much information that's being given out? If they were aware of it, did they just ignore it? So again, you'll find that the balance of the duty of responsibility goes back to the big people in the room, which is the adults, of course. So in what ways are we also trying to ensure that I know these are my rights, and I know this is how they are. Well, because just because we are adults and their children doesn't mean that the rules of data protection don't apply across the board. They do apply. And sometimes for children, they apply even more than they do to us as adults. So again,
what does the law say about minors, the data protection law in Kenya? Sorry.
The Kenyan Data Protection Act.
In a minute.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Data Protection Act, just in a minute, attributes responsibility for any data protection rights, for the exercise of any data protection rights to the adult. Yeah, so basically that's it. If you're a minor, it's your mom, dad, guardian.
So you cannot collect a minor's data in the absence of.
Yes, actually, that's
Okay.
correct.
Right.
In the absence of consent from a guardian.
Okay. I want to try and wrap up this conversation. Mina, I'm going to come to you. Let me first listen to the lady.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I concur with her. The data protection law in Uganda states that a minor doesn't have capacity to either say no or yes. We all know a minor is somebody who may not be capable of, making sound judgment. So the decision in this situation is taken by an adult who is referred to as the guardian, but this adult is also held to a certain standard. It has to be in the best interests of the minor. If it's a school, yes, the school is manned by administration, teachers and all, but the parents have to be in the know. They have to know what's going on. Now, you asked a question that says, do fines and penalties, are they going to kind of encourage compliance? I would like to disagree to a greater extent. You see, naturally, even as a child, when you put this pen here and you tell me don't touch it, I am inclined to touch to find out if is it hot, does it bite or something like that. So I believe if I, the subject, appreciate why I need to protect certain data about myself, certain data about this, then it will just come naturally for me to be responsible and be intentional with the way I treat, I collect, I give out data, everything just comes naturally. So it's about making people appreciate, understand the value of data, personal data, public data, everything. Then there was something about, yeah, basically that's it. The way we are going to encourage people to respect data. I'm talking about, I'm going to give a scenario of a rural setting where the government has maybe some programs it wants to roll out. So it's going to go through the local leaderships. The first point of contact in a community, you have the police officers and they work together with maybe local council chairpersons or RDCs. I don't know the kitchen structure, but it's equivalent. Then they will come to me as me, who knows, the value of personal data. And yeah, they will come to me and then this man will say, put your name here, put here, sex, age, when were you born, contact number, your mother, your father, your what? Then of course I will say, I'm sorry, but I would like to know what this information is going to be used. Now this man will look at me and say, now look at this one. You are wasting our time. I'm just giving a composition of an ideal situation.
Yeah.
You're wasting our time. If you don't want, you go. I will fill the form, but I'll tell them what they want to hear, not what they ought to hear. You understand? It all goes back to both of us appreciating that I am entitled to ask this person for them to understand that they need to explain and convince me that they are collecting this data for reason X, Y, and Z. That is why I will give them the accurate data. They will come to me day one and they will collect data. I will just pinky, ponky. What I feel comes to my head is what I'll put there. Then they'll go do their research. And then based on that data, they will customize a certain product to this community and it will not serve the purpose. We shall lose out as a community. Yeah. But do you realize that the chain comes from the information that they collected and I gave them wrong information because I felt something was not right. The next time they will come to me, if they explain and convince me and I appreciate, I intentionally appreciate that they are collecting this data because they need to use it to arrive at a certain decision. They need to customize a certain service for me, the community, my neighbor, my grandfather, my uncle who is in this village. I will give them the accurate data, what they are looking for. And when they use this data, they will customize whatever it is that they are going to use this data for, and then it will serve purpose.
Yeah.
But you all understand that it's a chain. You know where it comes from. That's it.
Thank you.
It's about appreciating me, my rights, my obligations as the data subject. You, the data collector, your rights, your obligations. Yes, you have the upper hand. You're a local council chairperson, but then this is my data, me. So vis-a-vis collecting data, yes, you collect a box ticking approach and then we shall move regardless, but it will not serve purpose. And that's how resources get wasted. Then we start criticizing government. They don't involve us. There is no inclusion, but the process started from. Am I right?
You're right. You are right. I think that your submission brings into context the element of power and the power dynamics that exist in data governance ecosystem. I think for compliance, it's simple. Allow the people, the subjects, to have the power and the control over their data, and also explain to them the benefits that will come out of the process, and it will happen here. Thank you. In 1 minute, and then we can close up this.
Okay. About why we aren't leaving the data protection laws. I just wanted to add more. Most of us, we have said about the lack of awareness of this. I want to give a living example. When we were doing the engagements of when this process of the law was going on and we were meeting these people, for instance, we met religious leaders. In Tanzania, if you are aware, religious leaders, they have big influence. So when we met these, and they were top leaders, they were asking us that, how are we connected with this?
Yeah.
They did know that they are also data collectors in one or the other, because these people, they have our names, they have where we live and everything. So you could tell they didn't know their duty and their responsibility in all this process. So I guess the awareness issue is still a problem. Like how I'm connected to this. Is this also identifying that this is the personal data that I'm supposed to be protecting? It's also a problem. And adding on what he's saying, I'm in support of what he's saying. Sometimes we give data based on the approach. So we need to change that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I want to wrap this up. I want to bring back the ball to the panelists, and thank you so much, everyone, for your submissions. I want to bring back the ball to the panelists as we wrap up. We have about six minutes to the top of the hour. As we wrap up, what are some good practices and case studies on gender inclusive data governance and digital rights that you've known of? Please try to keep it to the African continent, something relatable, but if you must, then cross borders, and then also give us your closing remarks. Victor.
Thank you. I think in closing, for gender responsiveness, I think we really side with a lot of the comments Angela has made on especially when you look at data and even from now the data governance point, all aspects, especially gender, there are many other aspects that we need to consider, but especially gender should not be an afterthought that after we implement some of these things, then we think, oh, how do we include gender? Let's start most of these things from the get-go. The last comment I would have is just on the need for, mostly because this forum is largely populated by people from civil society and actors within the space, is that we need to build stronger coalitions to get to our end of this tunnel, which is a sustainable data governance system or architecture for ourselves, for our continent, and for our own challenges within this continent.
Thank you, Victor. That speaks to, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Is there a place for non-technical people in the data governance conversation?
Yes, yes, there is. I mean, this data conversation has, of course, it has always been framed as a very elite club, as the comment on the Zoom chat was made. But it's largely because of how these conversations are had, where these conversations are had, to the exclusion of the majority. And so we need to go to the people, and we need to go to where these conversations matter most, because the violations are out there. The people who need this information are out there.
Okay. Victor, what's your background? Very personal question. Now that you say this conversation is not for technical people only.
Background is in law.
Okay. Yes, over to you, Angela.
I'd like to finalize by saying that some of the concepts we think are complex, elitist, are very relatable. I'll give an example. I'll keep it short. I think the first or second week of June, I was holding a training for women on civic technology, on how they can use technology for public participation. And they were analyzing a bill on which seeks to regulate dominant market shareholders like Safaricom and the like. And they didn't understand why a dominant person in the market should be regulated. And then I made an announcement and I told them that I'm going to be giving reimbursements and I will not be able to transfer money to people who don't have a Safaricom line. And then it clicked in their minds that Safaricom is a dominant shareholder in the market at the time, and they were able to understand why they need to be regulated. The same thing applies to data protection laws and policies. A lot of what might be said in this room might sound like jargon, but the more we interact with the data protection legislations, the easier it will be for us to break them down to the common wananchi with examples that they can grasp.
Yeah.
Finally, on what agenda the utopia will look like, I think we need to start really considering gender data within the confines of sensitive data, because the impact is very gendered. Look, for instance, an application that is for menstrual tracking, for instance. That data collected there can be used in even saying someone has committed abortion or not.
Yeah.
It's very sensitive.
Yeah.
So we need to keep in mind that gender data, as long as it connotes to sex, sexual orientation, gender expression, this is sensitive data. It should be collected when it is very, very necessary. And even in that case, with the consent of the data subject.
Asante. Are you referring to the case of Roe versus Wade? Okay. Victor, I remembered what I wanted to say, that inclusion shouldn't be an add-on. So gender shouldn't be looked at an afterthought.
Comment is quite similar to Victor's and on gender not being an afterthought. The data collection and processing, analyzing, that process, that entire process is very detailed. And when people sit down and decide that this is what we want to do, this is the data we're trying to collect within this specific demographic for this specific purpose, there's meetings, there's multiple meetings, there's a lot of planning that goes into it, there's a lot of policy structuring that goes into it. So the thing is to ensure from the very beginning of it that you're trying to ensure that you look at things from a gendered perspective, if need be, because most people assume that it's not necessary, which also goes again to the fact that elements of gender are not considered applicable across the board and across all elements and all aspects, which in fact they are. Small example would be temperature for men and women, how they would, the women generally are, we are warm people. We are very warm people. We are very warm people. Men, on the other hand, they might like slightly colder temperatures. So just a tiny example, if in the room you find that there's more women, but the AC, the temperatures are extremely low and it's extremely cold, who does it serve? Maybe the 3-4 men who are in the room, they'll be like, yeah, fine, you're okay. Then the women are complaining, they're like, it's too cold, it's too cold, it's too cold. And that time you'll find the person who's running the AC is also a man and he's like, these are normal temperatures for us. Yeah. So you wouldn't think that those elements apply across the board in the most tiniest of things, but they actually do. So trying to consider that from the beginning, not once we've done the analysis is when you're like, okay, wait, we need to go back and figure out if we collected data that could be gendered, and then try and figure out how to wrap it up and just make it look.
Thank you, Florence.
visible.
The personal question, you're a lawyer, right?
Pardon?
You're a lawyer.
Pardon?
Are you a legal person?
Yes, yes, I am. Legal
Angela?
background.
My God. Paul, please tell me you're not a lawyer. Because you have said there's space for non-technical people, please.
Why do you want that information? Yeah, I think my closing remarks before I answer your question is I think as we've been discussing the data governance, I think there are two data then governance is it is systematic. So it's about having a robust legal framework, having very strong institutions that then can be held accountable for practices. But also, I think talking about penalties, I think we need to test test the law to see that it works.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you don't test it, then because when you test the law through strategic litigation, it gives you another opportunity to engage the wider public and then create awareness with the wananchi. Because if they know that actually I can sue this person for collecting data without my consent, because the law has been, I think the Kenyans have been really good at this, but I think we remember the 2/3 majority. It is until somebody sued and challenged, that's when people, I think, woke up. The issue of the CAS, I think somebody was suing, and so it is being tested, and now people are becoming aware that actually this law should be implemented. But if you don't test the law, then it becomes very hard for the one to get involved. Right. And I will not answer you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Let's clap for our panelists for the comprehensive conversation. And as they move back to their seats, I'm going to ask the people to play the video. But I want to thank everyone, and I hope this conversation has been valuable for you. Please follow AIRA, the Africa Internet Rights Alliance, on Facebook and Twitter, and I think they have a website as well. It's an open network if you're interested in joining as an organization to, explore issues around data governance, issues around internet rights. You're welcome. Thank you very much, everyone. I can already see they're setting up the food. Very important information. Please stick around, and then we can wind down the evening. Have a great one. Please, the video.
In October 2020, 9 African organizations across the continent came together. We stand for accountability, inclusion, equity, and digital rights for all on the African continent. The African Internet Rights Alliance collectively works to address the inequalities and challenges we face online that are also reflected offline, as the internet and technology become more and more integrated into the lives of Africans. We face new challenges to our human rights in the digital context, including unequal access, internet shutdowns and restrictions, and violence online. Join us in the movement to advance inclusive and equitable digital rights for all on the African continent.